Welcome to Dressmakers Design Studio. My name is Andi and I am a professional dressmaker, designer and a sewing teacher, and I have an online sewing school called Dressmakers Design Studio. Here is your course on hand stitching. This is a course from the school itself. Make sure you like and subscribe and you can see a lot more sewing content. Welcome to hand stitching. Let's go through all the things that you're going to need for this course. I've got multiple layers of white cotton woven fabric. I have some contrast thread. This is just a polyester everyday thread, some thread snips, some hand stitch needles, whatever brand that you can get is perfectly fine. This is a little leather thimble. You don't have to get it like this, but I do prefer to use a leather ones. And this is a piece of beeswax, and this is what I actually use to coat my threads in order to make it go really nice and smoothly through the fabrics, and it really does reduce a lot of the snags and knots that you're going to get in your thread while you're hand stitching. So this is how I do it. I like to thread my needle and put a little bit of wax on it before you put the knot in. Now, I don't actually like putting a knot in my threads, and I prefer to actually put a knot in the thread while it's actually in the fabric itself, and I'm going to show you how I do that in just a second. So here I've just put the wax onto the thread, and then I've run my fingers on it to spread it evenly and to get rid of any excess. Now this is how I put a knot in my hand stitching. So I bring the needle up from underneath, I leave a fairly long tail on the back, and then I just bring my needle in just around where the thread has come up through the fabric. And then once I do this, I bring the needle back through that loop that I've just made, and I've just made a knot within the fabric itself. Now this knot is very low profile. I haven't left a big lump in the back of my thread, in the back of my fabric, and this is perfectly secure. It's exactly the same as making a knot in the thread itself before you even start stitching. So I hope this helps, and this is how I'm going to be starting off all of my hand stitching in this entire course. Enjoy! So here is the very first two stitches that you need to become very familiar with. These are called basting stitches, and these have been around since before pins were a thing. They are actually probably one of the most useful stitches that you will know. So this is the first one, called the even basting stitch. Now I've just put a few marker points here to show you that I'm just going to be putting the needle here in one and out the other. It looks very similar to a running stitch because I've got just one layer of fabric here, but if you have multiple layers of fabric that you have to keep nice and flat and so that there's no shifting between, you would actually just put the needle in one, pull the thread taut, and then out the next one. So what we're doing here is that there is an even amount of space between the stitches, and that the stitch length and the space between them is exactly the same. So I use this one especially if I've got multiple layers of fabric. This really helps to hold all the fabrics nice and flat, but keeps it all together really well for before I need to stitch anything together. I do tend to use this for much thicker fabrics, but for fine fabrics this works fantastic as well, especially if the pins are going to be distorting the fabric before you stitch them and it ends up looking a little bit wonky or bubbly. So I really do like using basting stitches instead of using pins. So this one is called the uneven basting stitch, and this is really good for marking out seam lines or dart lines. It's used for much more like, it's not really to hold the fabric together, it's just to mark the lines. So it's if you don't really need very much control with the fabrics, and it's just for marking. I do use this one especially when it comes to marking out dart lines. If I need to put a button or some kind of a pocket as well, and I don't really think it's going to handle being marked using like a pen or a marker of some kind. So this is a really great way to mark seam lines or outlines for something that will be needed later on in the future, and you think the wear that you're going to be causing on the garment while you're sewing is going to wear away the markers. So this is a really great way to put that into your fabric. This is called the diagonal basting stitch. This is actually one that I use fairly often. It's to hold multiple layers of fabric together, especially to hold a curve in the fabric as well. So I use this in a technique called roll pinning for my corset making. where I take multiple layers of the panel piece and I put it over a curve and I put these particular stitches into it. So on the outside it looks like they're going diagonal, but on the back it's actually horizontal stitches going up the fabric. So I would do these particular stitches going with the grain, and it's usually going up and down the garment. And then for a tight curve, the stitches themselves would actually follow the curve of the fabric itself. So the smaller stitches that I'm about to show you here, they are used for a much tighter curve, and the larger stitches are used for much larger areas of the fabric that needs to be held together. So what we're going to be doing is that you're going to be seeing like lines of these kinds of stitches going up and down the garment, following the curve of the garment and how it actually needs to be worn on the body. So these are the kind of stitches that when they are permanent, let's say for a jacket, they are actually the entire structure of how it's all held together neatly and how the curve is held within the garment. So this is one of my favorite stitches to know. I really like being able to use these in the permanent setting, especially for a garment that is going to be having these on the inside of the lining. These are called pad stitches, and it's used in very much the same way, but this really does help to hold together multiple layers of fabric, and they're quite easy to get out as well because we have those large pieces of thread there. So this last stitch I'm going to show you for the temporary stitches is the running stitch. I feel like this is the very first stitch that everybody sort of learns when they first start sewing. Honestly, I really only use this stitch if I'm going to be marking out a seam line of some kind, and I'm not really a fan of this one. It's never really been a favorite of mine because I feel like it's not really even and it does distort the fabric quite a lot. I prefer to use the uneven basting stitches for marking out a seam line, but this one here can be of use as well. So this is one technique to use. So I just put the needle in and then I push the fabric up underneath, try to make sure it's fairly equal, and go from there. So this is the running stitch, so we don't do a knot on either end because we want to just be able to pull it straight out if as soon as you're finished with the construction. And there are your first temporary stitches. This is called a back stitch. Now this is the traditional stitch that was used to stitch all of our clothing together. It's a very strong stitch, but it's a very small stitch as well. Imagine being a stitch that's only about 2 to 3 millimeters wide, and what I'm showing you here, that little tiny stitch there is about 3 to 4 millimeters. So these typical stitches were a lot smaller than what I'm showing you here, but I needed to be able to show you, so I did them quite a bit bigger. I do it a little bit smaller later on. So you can see here, I've just secured it in place. I've put the knot in and then I've brought the needle back a little bit. So I'm going kind of backwards and then jumping forwards really well. So you can see how the needle is going in back where the last stitch ended, but I'm bringing it back out again twice the length. That way I'm creating the space and doing a stitch at the same time. So this is how it looks when it's quite big, and that's what the back of it looks like. It's essentially doubling everything up. And now I'm showing you how it's done very, very small. Even then they can do them a lot smaller than this. So this is a typical back stitch, and this is what is used if you wanted to do a permanent stitch by hand and still have it be a very strong stitch. It does use quite a lot of thread though. So if you wanted to make it so that there's using a little bit less thread, the next stitch is what you would typically use. It's not the neatest, but it does the job. So that's what it looks like on the back. So it's a very secure stitch. Now this one is called the half back stitch, and this is where instead of covering the entire space in the stitch, you'd only go about halfway. So there's quite a lot more space in between where the needle goes in and where it comes back out again, but it's doing the exact same thing. You're essentially just doing loops in the fabric, but except this time, instead of bringing the needle back all the way to where the previous stitch was, you're only going about halfway through that space that you've created. And that means that it is still a fairly secure stitch that you're doing. There's just a lot more space in between where the needle goes in and out of the fabric, but it is still quite a strong stitch. Also, you can note here that when I'm doing these stitches, I'm just doing them on one single piece of fabric, and I'm doing them in a way where they're very easy for you to see, but you'll have to look at your particular situation, how many layers of fabric that you've got, depending on the size and the most comfortable way of doing each of these stitches. So these are typically permanent stitches, and this is the way that we used to stitch all of our clothing together. So this is both the overhand and the whip stitch. I'm showing these in 2 in 1 because they're actually very similar stitches. They're just done backwards. So one is one way, one is the other way. Now for this one, I've got my wax thread, and I've got my two strands of wax thread, and then I'm tying a knot in them. Because what I'm actually doing is that I'm going to be putting the needle through here, and then as it's almost all the way through, I'm going to be bringing the needle back through the 2 threads here, and that's going to help create a really nice secure end to this particular stitch. So let me show you how to do the overhand thread, the overhand stitch. So we bring in the needle on one piece of fabric, and then we go diagonally into the next one. So this has got 2 pieces of fabric that are right sides together, and you're seeing the seam allowance on either side here. So for this next stitch, it's directly above where the other stitch has just come out, and then you go diagonally in between, just like that. So this is like the opposite of doing a whip stitch, but this one here tends to help the fabric to butt up against each other really nice and smoothly. I feel like this is a much better stitch to make a really nice smooth but still a very tight seam here. So essentially what we've done is we have 2 pieces of fabric that are right sides together. The seam allowances are like on the outside, what you can see here. And then when you put the needle in, you just only catch just a couple of threads of the fabric. And if you want to make it really nice and small, so you really don't see the stitches very much, just make it so that the diagonal is not quite as far from the previous stitch. So you can see right here, that's what it looks like from the outside. So you can see how the fabric is butted up right up against each other. It's still fairly tight. You can really see the stitches because I did them pretty big, and they're a little bit irregular, but if it was the same color as the fabric, I'm just trying to make it as obvious as possible so that you can see the process. But you can see how on the left it's very small, and on the right it's very big. It's still doing the same thing as you can see here. It just, if I'd used the same color thread, you really wouldn't be able to see it. But this is a way to show the different sizes for it, and it's very secure for that bottom one. So the next one is going to be the whip stitch. This is essentially doing the exact same thing, just backwards, which you will see. This is a very common stitch. You're essentially just putting the needle in through both of the layers of fabric at the same time, and the diagonal piece is on the top, which is what makes that whip sort of look to it, where it's just going around in loops. So there you go. There's the diagonal section is on the top. Sorry, I kept bumping the camera. The diagonal part of the stitch is along the top, but unfortunately this is what creates the lump along that section where the seam is. So instead of it butting up against each other, you're going to get that little lump where it's stitched along the seam here. So if you don't want that bump and you want it to be butted up against each other and it's all really nice and smooth, use the overhand stitch. But if you don't mind having that bump in there and just wanted to do it like this, because this is actually a little bit easier to do it this way, then just do the whip stitch and that's fine. So it's essential to keep it nice and tight as well throughout the whole process. This is why wax thread really does help with doing this. It actually helps to hold the thread really nice and tightly in the fabric. So you can see there's the straight stitch part of it right there, but you can see there is that little bump. There is that little bump right there, and you can see here we've got the smaller stitches on the left and the bigger stitches on the right, and you still have that bump no matter how small those stitches are, but it does do a very secure stitch. So this is both the overhand stitch and the whip stitch. Which one do you prefer? This is the blanket stitch. Now, this is a very common stitch that was used for very thick blankets, like especially wool blankets. This was used to edge around it, so like hem around the fabric, because the fabric used to be very, very thick. It still is very, very thick. So this is the stitch that we use to hold all of the threads along the outside, along the edges of the fabric together. So I'm doing it very large here so that you can obviously see how to actually do the stitch itself. So we're putting it in the fabric quite a fair distance down from the edge, wrapping the thread around it, and then just bringing it all the way through so that you're catching the little hoop, the loop here. So just like this, and it's fairly loose. We don't want this one very tight. It's just, we want to have that straight edge along the very top of the edge of the fabric, because that is what's going to be holding the fibers in place of the fabric. So I'm doing it like this so that you can obviously see how we actually do the stitch, but it's up to you as to how big you want it to be depending on the type of fabric that you're going to be working with. So this is what the traditional blanket stitch is. So this is me going from left to right, and this is going from right to left, depending on how it's easier for you to do the hemming on the fabric that you're using. So this is how it would have been done, especially around the edges of a big blanket or something, or a big rug maybe. It can also be used for applique as well. You just got to have to figure out how it's all going to be placed on the fabric, and then you use this particular stitch for it. So it's a fairly simple stitch. Honestly, I think it was one of the very first stitches that I ever learned how to do when I was living with my grandparents. They would teach me how to do this to all of the blankets and things that they were making at the time. So it's a fairly quick stitch, and it just makes a really nice edge. Obviously, it looks really obvious right here, but you can make it as big or small as you want. So this is just me finishing it off, just catching that last little edge, and there is the blanket stitch. So you just make a little knot there at the end, just catching that edge, and all done. So this is the slip stitch, and I also call this one the ladder stitch. It's actually one of my favorite stitches to do because it turns out completely invisible. So what I've got is I have my wax thread, and I have put a knot in the end of this one. So what I've done is that I've put the needle in both sides, and then just before the thread goes all the way through, I bring the needle back through the two lines of thread just below the knot, so that way I can create a really good join and it's not going to come undone. Excuse the bandage here, this is when I was still healing from my hand injury. So this is essentially what we do, is we just put the needle in right along that fold, and it can be any size depending on the space that you have to stitch, but this is about a little bit more than 5 millimeters, I believe. So we bring the needle in, and this is going into the fold. We're not actually going all the way through the two layers of fabric. So this is what it's going to look like from both sides, essentially. There we go. So it turns out to be very invisible, and I use this stitch for multiple things. And this is actually what it looks like from the inside. So this is the inside, and this is what you're not going to see. But you can see how it's essentially a running stitch that is going from either side of these two folds, and you can make these stitches as big or as small as what you would like, and I actually use this fairly often. So if you have two pieces of fabric that need to be stitched together invisibly, this is what I would absolutely use, either the ladder stitch or the slip stitch, whatever you want to call them. So we have a beautiful seam right here. The closer you have the stitches together, the more secure the stitch.